Clara Whitfield pressed her mother's recipe book against her chest so hard the leather spine left a mark through her dress. She heard every word Nathaniel Callahan said to his foreman. He didn't lower his voice because he didn't think she deserved that courtesy. "Send her back. She's soft. She'll be dead by January." Clara did not cry. She did not turn around. She walked straight through the front door of that kitchen, set her wooden box on the counter, and started a fire. If you've ever been counted out before you were given a chance, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow along to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1883, and the whole town seemed to stop breathing for exactly the wrong reason. It wasn't the kind of stop that comes from awe. It was the kind that comes from disbelief. The slow creeping, almost entertained disbelief of people who think they are about to witness a disaster and don't mind watching it unfold. Clara Whitfield was the last one off the coach. She came down those wooden steps one at a time, both hands gripping the rail because the step was higher than she expected, and she was carrying her bag on one arm and the wooden box on the other, and she did not want to drop either one. She was wearing her best dress, the blue one she had mended twice at the collar, and her boots were polished as clean as leather that old could be polished. Her hair was pinned back the way her mother had taught her, neat, simple, nothing fancy. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and she weighed perhaps 120 pounds after a hard winter. She stepped onto the main street of Harlan Creek and looked around once carefully, the way you look at a place you want to understand before it forms an opinion of you. She saw the mercantile, the livery stable, the church with the crooked steeple. 2 women standing outside the dry goods store who stopped talking the moment they saw her. She saw Nathaniel Callahan, who was standing 20 feet away with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he purchased through a catalog that arrived broken. Not angry exactly. Not yet. Just disappointed in a way that had already made up its mind. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen real weather, and boots caked with the kind of mud that comes from actual work. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same Wyoming rock that lined every ridge around this valley, and dark eyes that gave away nothing. He was 34 years old, and he had been running the Callahan Ranch for 12 of those years, ever since his father handed it to him, and promptly died. And in those 12 years, he had built it from a struggling operation into the largest cattle enterprise in 3 counties. He had done that by being decisive, by being correct, by not making mistakes. Clara watched him look at her and understood immediately that in his mind she was already a mistake. She walked toward him anyway. "Mr. Callahan," she said, and her voice came out steady, which she was grateful for because her hands were not entirely steady and she hoped he couldn't tell. "I'm Clara Whitfield, from Independence, Missouri. I believe we had a correspondence." He looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat too long. Then he looked at the single bag she was carrying. Then at the wooden box. "That all you brought?" he said. "Yes, sir." He didn't say anything else. He turned and started walking toward a wagon parked at the edge of the street, and that was apparently his version of a welcome. Behind her, Clara heard one of the women from outside the dry goods store say something in a low voice, and the other one laughed. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the shape of them, and she knew exactly what they meant. She followed Nathaniel Callahan to his wagon, set her bag in the back, kept the wooden box on her lap, and did not look back at the women. The ranch was 6 miles outside of town, and Nathaniel Callahan did not speak for 5 of them. Clara looked at the country around her and said nothing either. She had grown up in Missouri in a house with a yard and a garden, and neighbors near enough to borrow flour from. The landscape she was moving through now was something else entirely, wide and cold and high. The sky so enormous it seemed to press down, instead of lifting up the land, rolling out in every direction like something that had never decided to stop. The mountains to the west were already showing snow on the peaks. The grass along the road had gone the color of straw. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they do not care whether you find them beautiful or not. Halfway through the 5th mile, Nathaniel spoke. "You ever worked a ranch before?" he said. No, sir. Ever lived outside a city? I grew up in Independence. It's not exactly a city. It's not exactly Wyoming either. No, Clara said. It's not. Another stretch of quiet. Then he said, My last housekeeper left in April. Took the cook with her. I've got 31 men on this property and nobody who knows how to run a kitchen. The foreman's been managing meals, and he's terrible at it. Men are eating bad and sleeping worse, and their work is starting to show it. I see, Clara said. I need someone who can keep order, not someone I have to look after. Clara turned and looked at him directly for the first time. Mr. Callahan, she said, I have not asked you to look after me. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye, and then looked back at the road. No, he said after a moment. I suppose you haven't. They didn't speak again until the ranch came into view, and when it did, Clara looked at it without saying a word, because what she was looking at was not what she had imagined from the letters, and she needed a moment to simply see it clearly. The house was large, larger than she expected, a two-story structure of timber and stone that had clearly been built by someone with money and less interest in beauty. It was solid. It was imposing. It was surrounded by outbuildings and corrals, and a bunkhouse that stretched the length of a city block. And beyond all of that were the pastures rolling out toward the mountains, dotted with cattle as far as she could see. It was a serious place, a working place. It did not look like somewhere that had room for softness. Nathaniel pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down before she had gathered her things. He didn't offer a hand. She didn't wait for one. She climbed down herself, set the wooden box carefully on the ground, and retrieved her bag from the back. A man came out of the barn, older, weathered, moving with the particular slowness of someone whose joints had been arguing with him for years. He looked at Clara with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not unkind, but careful. This is Elias Boone, Nathaniel said. He's been here longer than anyone. You have questions about the property, you ask him. Yes, sir, Clara said. She looked at Elias. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Boone. Elias looked at her hand when she extended it, then shook it once briefly. Ma'am, he said. Nathaniel was already walking toward the house. Kitchen's in the back, he said over his shoulder. Supplies are a mess. I expect supper at 6. Clara picked up her things and followed him. The kitchen was in the back, and it was in fact a mess, but not the kind of mess that comes from neglect. It was the kind that comes from 31 people doing their best with no system and no knowledge and no one in charge. Sacks of flour stacked wrong. Barrels of salt pork opened and not resealed properly. A pantry where things were stored wherever there was space rather than wherever they made sense. Onions going soft next to beans that had been stored too damp. A spice shelf where half the jars had no labels and the other half had labels that were wrong. Clara set the wooden box on the table. She opened it. Inside, in order, wrapped in cloth and held flat with a strip of leather, were her mother's recipe cards. 214 of them, accumulated over 30 years of cooking for a large family with varying amounts of money and a consistent need to make things stretch. Beside them was a small notebook, half filled with Clara's own additions. Beside that was a piece of paper folded into quarters. She unfolded the paper. It was an inventory sheet blank. She had brought her own. She picked up a pencil and started walking through the pantry. At 6 o'clock, the ranch hands came in for supper and found something they had not found in 6 months. A meal that was ready on time, served hot, and tasted like someone had thought about it. It was not elaborate. Clara had not had time to be elaborate. There was a beef stew made from the salt pork and the root vegetables that were closest to turning seasoned, with what was actually on the shelves, once she sorted through the mislabeled jars. There was a loaf of bread she had made 4, because she had counted the men, and it had come out right on the first try, which it didn't always, and she was quietly grateful for that. There was coffee properly made, because she had found the good grounds behind a tin of rusted nails, and understood that whoever had been in charge of this kitchen had given up trying to find things a long time ago. 31 men sat down at long wooden tables in the dining room, and for a few moments nobody said anything. Then one of them said, "Lord Almighty," and then they all started eating. Clara stood near the kitchen doorway and watched. She was not eating yet. She was watching to see if anything was wrong because this was the first meal, and the first meal always told you things. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. He ate without speaking, which was apparently his habit, but Clara noticed that he finished everything on his plate and did not leave the table early, which he had apparently been doing for months because the food had not been worth staying for. When supper was finished and the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, Elias Boone stopped near the kitchen door and looked in at Clara, who was washing up. "That was a fine meal, ma'am," he said. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." He stood there a moment. "Where'd you learn to cook like that?" "My mother," Clara said. "She cooked for 7 children on a schoolteacher's income. She never had enough of anything. She learned to make what she had into what she needed." Elias was quiet for a moment. "That's a useful skill," he said finally. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." He nodded once and left. Clara went back to washing up. She did not see Nathaniel until the next morning. He came into the kitchen while she was starting the breakfast fire, still pulling on his coat, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the kitchen. Really looked at it the way she had already begun reorganizing the shelves. The inventory sheet she had tacked to the inside of the pantry door. The crock she had properly sealed the night before after supper. "You worked past midnight," he said. It wasn't a question. "There was a good deal to sort out," Clara said. She did not stop what she was doing. "I wasn't asking you to do all that in one night." "I know, but it made more sense to start right. A kitchen run wrong costs more than you think. Not just money, but time and waste and the kind of slow drain that's hard to see until it's already done damage." He looked at her. She looked back at him steady. "I'll have figures for you by the end of the week," she said. "What you're spending on supplies, and what you should be spending, and where the difference is going. I'd want to go over them with you." "You keep accounts," he said. "I keep track of things," she said. "There's a difference." He didn't respond to that. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot she had already made, tasted it and paused. Like he hadn't expected it to be that good. He set the cup down and left for the barn without another word. But he hadn't argued with her either. That was something. The first week established a rhythm. The second week confirmed it. By the third week, the ranch hands were arriving at meals 10 minutes early rather than 10 minutes late, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how things had been going before she arrived. She learned their names quickly, all 31 of them. She made a point of it because she had learned from her mother that people work harder when they believe the person feeding them actually sees them. Harlan, who had a bad shoulder and couldn't eat anything that required a hard chew. Pete, who was 17 years old and homesick and needed more food than the others and was embarrassed about it. Old Danny, who was the best rider on the property and had a particular weakness for dried apple, which Clara started keeping in a covered tin on the shelf, where he could reach it without having to ask. She noticed things. She listened. She asked questions when she had them, but she asked them of the right people. Elias, who had the longest memory, and May Watkins, who ran the neighboring farm with her husband and came by twice a week to trade eggs for news, and who had a clear, practical understanding of how this valley operated that no one had ever thought to ask for before. "You're not what everyone expected," May said about 3 weeks in sitting at Clara's kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't been asked if she wanted, but had accepted without hesitation. "I know," Clara said. "They all thought you'd be gone inside a month." "I know that too." May tilted her head. "Does it bother you?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "It would bother me more to give them a reason to be right," she said. May laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm. "I think I'm going to like you, Mrs. Callahan," she said. It was the first time anyone had called her that. Clara found that she didn't mind. Nathaniel remained difficult to read. How was not cruel. She had been prepared for cruel, and he wasn't that. He was simply closed, the kind of closed that comes from years of operating in a world where opening up had cost him things, though she didn't yet know what those things were. He answered her questions when she had them. He looked at the figures she brought him at the end of the first week and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Where's this loss coming from?" pointing at one column, and she explained it to him plainly, and he listened without interrupting. He approved the changes she proposed. He didn't offer praise for them, but he didn't obstruct them, which she understood was its own form of acknowledgement. Once coming back late from checking on a sick steer, he passed by the kitchen and saw the light still on. He stopped in the doorway. She was at the table with her notebook and her inventory sheets, and a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten was there. "It's past 11, he said. "I know," she said without looking up. "You don't have to work yourself to the bone." She looked up then. "Do you stop working at 11, Mr. Callahan?" He said nothing. "I didn't think so," she said, and went back to her notebook. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "The bread is better than anything we've had in years." And he walked away before she could respond. Clara sat with that for a long moment. Then she wrote it down in the margin of her notebook, because she wrote down things that mattered, and somehow that had mattered. What none of them knew, not Nathaniel, not Elias, not May Watkins, was what was inside that wooden box besides the recipe cards. Under the recipes, wrapped in a square of oilcloth that had been pressed so many times, the creases were permanent, was a packet of letters. Not love letters. Legal letters. A correspondence between her father and a banker in St. Louis, going back 4 years, detailing a loan agreement that had never been honored, and a piece of farmland in Missouri that had been seized improperly, and that seizure had left Clara's family with nothing the year before her mother died. Clara had spent 2 years trying to find a lawyer who would take the case, and had found 3 who promised to, and then disappeared when it became clear the banker had friends in the circuit court. She had run out of money, run out of time, and eventually run out of options. And when the advertisement from a ranch owner in Wyoming territory, seeking a capable housekeeper and wife, had crossed her desk through a connection at her church, she had looked at it for a long time. She had written to Nathaniel Callahan because she needed a start, not because she needed a husband. She had been honest about that in a way. Her letter had been practical, direct, and careful. She had described her skills and her background and her intentions without sentiment. She had not pretended this was a romantic arrangement. But she had also not told him about the letters. About the banker. About what had been taken and why she'd had to leave Missouri with 1 bag and a wooden box. She told herself she would handle the legal matter on her own. She told herself it had nothing to do with the ranch or with Nathaniel Callahan, and therefore didn't need to be his concern. She told herself a great many things. Walter Grayson arrived on a Thursday, which was a bad day for him to come, and a worse one for Clara. She had been on the Callahan ranch for 5 weeks, and she had spent the morning with a rider who had come in from the northwest pasture with news that 3 head of cattle had wandered through a damaged fence line. She was trying to work out the most efficient way to route the repair crew. Nathaniel was out on the property, and she hadn't been able to reach him, and she had May Watkins sitting at the table, helping her think through it when Grayson rode up. Walter Grayson was not a small man in any sense. He was built wide, ran 3 ranches and a freighting business, and carried himself like someone who had never once been wrong about anything, and expected the universe to keep confirming that impression. He had been trying to buy the northwest corner of the Callahan property for 2 years, and Nathaniel had turned him down twice with the kind of quiet finality that Grayson had apparently decided to interpret as an opening position rather than a conclusion. He came to the kitchen door, which was not where visitors came, and knocked once. Clara opened it. He looked at her the way men like Grayson look at women they have already decided don't matter. "Where's Callahan?" he said. "Out on the property," Clara said. "I'm not sure when he'll be back. I can leave him a message that you came by." "Who are you?" Clara kept her expression level. "I'm Mrs. Callahan," she said. Grayson's eyebrows rose. Not in surprise exactly. More like confirmation of something he had already suspected and found mildly contemptible. "The mail order," he said. "His wife," Clara said. Grayson looked past her at the kitchen. At May Watkins, who had gone very still at the table. At the inventory sheets on the counter. At the organized pantry and the properly sealed crocks and the careful, quiet evidence of a system at work. "He actually let you start messing with his operation," Grayson said. "He asked me to manage the household," Clara said. "That's what I'm doing." "From Missouri, aren't you, city girl?" He said it the way people say things they mean to sting. "You got any idea what you're into out here, ma'am? This is Wyoming. This isn't a place for—" He paused, looked her up and down. Housewives playing ranch. May Watkins pushed back her chair. Clara put out one hand, a small gesture without turning around. May stopped. "Mr. Grayson," Clara said, "I appreciate that you came by. When Mr. Callahan returns, I'll let him know you were here. Is there a message you'd like me to pass along?" "You tell him I want to talk about that fence line in the northwest quarter," Grayson said. "And I'd suggest to you, Mrs. Callahan, that you stick to your kitchen." He turned and walked back toward his horse. Clara stood in the doorway until he had ridden away. Then she closed the door and turned around. May was looking at her with an expression that had moved from restrained fury to something approaching admiration. "You should have let me say something," May said. "What would you have said?" "Something considerably less polite than what you said." "I know," Clara said. She went back to the table and looked at the repair routing diagram. "And it wouldn't have helped anything." "It would have helped me," May said. Despite herself, Clara smiled. "The fence needs to be routed through the east pasture," she said. "Not the west. That's the more efficient line." May looked at the diagram. "You're right," she said after a moment. "Lord, you're right about that." "Tell me what you know about Grayson," Clara said. "Everything." When Nathaniel came in that evening, the fence crew was already dispatched. Supper was on the table. And Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with a full account of every interaction Walter Grayson had ever had with the Callahan Ranch, transcribed from May Watkins's considerable memory, organized by date, and annotated where she thought the annotations would be useful. Nathaniel stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the papers on the table. "He came by," Clara said. "I heard." He stepped in, pulled off his hat, hung it on the nail by the door that he always used. "What did he want?" "He wants to talk about the northwest fence line. He claims it's a property issue." She pushed the papers across the table toward him. "But based on what May Watkins told me, I think he's looking for a reason to reopen the conversation about buying that quarter. The fence is a pretext." Nathaniel sat down across from her. He picked up the papers and read through them, and his expression as he read was not easy to interpret. Then he set them down. "You put this together today," he said. "This afternoon. May Watkins told you all of this." "May Watkins knows everything that happens in this valley," Clara said. "No one has ever asked her to share it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the papers, but she thought he wasn't really seeing them anymore. "What did he say to you?" he said. "Grayson." "Nothing I haven't heard before." "Clara." "He told me to stick to my kitchen," she said. "Which is where I was when he arrived and where I went back to when he left." Nathaniel looked at her. She looked back at him. Something shifted in his expression, something brief and quickly controlled, but she caught it. Something that looked for just a moment like anger on her behalf. "He won't come to the kitchen door again," Nathaniel said. "I'd prefer you didn't make it into a confrontation on my account," Clara said. "It will only give him more to say about the mail-order wife who can't fight her own battles." "What would you prefer?" She was quiet for a moment. "Let me handle Grayson," she said. He stared at her. "How exactly?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But I'll know when I have more information. In the meantime," she tapped the papers, "read all of that, and trust me." The word hung in the air between them. Nathaniel picked up the papers again. He didn't answer, not directly, but he didn't argue with her either. He read. She made coffee. And somewhere in that kitchen, in the yellow light of the oil lamp, something that had been tightly closed began very slightly to open. It wasn't love yet. It wasn't close to love. But it was the first night Nathaniel Callahan sat across from his wife and thought of her as something other than a problem he had made for himself. And Clara Whitfield, for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach and heard a man she didn't know describe her as a mistake, thought of this ranch as something other than a place she had come to survive in. She thought of it as a place she was beginning to build. She didn't say that out loud, but she reached for her notebook and on a clean page in her careful, even handwriting, she wrote a single line. Begin the Northwest account. First entry, Thursday, October 18th, 1883. And then she underlined it, because the things that mattered she always underlined. The Northwest account grew. That was the first thing Clara noticed, as October turned cold, and November pressed down on the valley like a hand. The account grew not just in pages, but in weight. Every conversation she had with May Watkins, every offhand comment from Elias Boone, every piece of information that drifted through the kitchen, the way information always drifts through kitchens, all of it went into the notebook. Dates, names, patterns. The kind of careful record-keeping that her father had failed to do, which was precisely why a banker in St. Louis had been able to take everything he owned without anyone being able to prove a single thing. Clara had learned from that lesson the hardest way a person can learn something. She wrote everything down. She also, in those first weeks of November, began to understand the true shape of what she had walked into. The Callahan Ranch was not simply a cattle operation. It was an ecosystem, 31 men whose livelihoods depended on it. 6 neighboring farms that traded with it and relied on its stability. A town whose economy turned in no small part on what happened 6 miles out along the Western Road. When the ranch did well, Harlan Creek did well. When it struggled, the whole valley felt it in ways that didn't always announce themselves immediately. She hadn't understood that when she arrived. She understood it now. And she understood something else: the ranch was stronger than Nathaniel knew, and weaker than he knew, and both of those things were true at the same time in different places, and nobody had ever mapped it carefully enough to tell him which was which. She started doing that. She started with the feed costs, because that was where the most obvious waste was bleeding out. She cross-referenced 3 months of purchasing records against the actual consumption logs she had started keeping herself and found a gap that made her sit very still for a moment when she saw the full number. Not because it was someone stealing, she didn't believe that, not yet, but because nobody had ever looked at both sides of the ledger at the same time. Money was going out for supplies that were being stored wrong and spoiling before they could be used, and then more money was going out to replace what had been lost. And the whole cycle was invisible because no one person had ever seen the whole picture. She brought the figures to Nathaniel on a Friday evening. He was in the front room, working through paperwork at his desk, and he didn't look up immediately when she came in. She set the ledger pages on the corner of his desk and waited. He looked up. He looked at the pages. He picked them up. The silence that followed was the kind Clara had learned to read. Not the silence of a man who was dismissing what he saw. The silence of a man who was recalculating. "You're saying we're losing close to $400 a year just in spoilage," he said. "412 by my count. Could be higher. I've only been tracking for 6 weeks. And the solution is a rotation system for the dry stores, a better seal on the root cellar, and I need 2 more crocks for the salt pork. Total cost about $11. He looked at the pages again. Then he looked at her. $400, he said again, not quite to her. To the number. Yes, sir. Nobody caught this. Nobody was looking at both sides at once, she said. It's not a failure of the men. It's a failure of the system. There was no system. He set the pages down. Get the crocks, he said. Whatever else you need. Thank you. She turned to leave. Clara? She stopped. Where did you learn to read accounts like that? He said. She paused just a moment longer than she should have. My father kept poor ones, she said. I learned what that costs. She left before he could ask anything more. The crocks arrived from town the following Wednesday, and Pete, the 17-year-old who was still homesick and had started treating Clara's kitchen like a second home, helped her carry them in. He was the good worker, Pete, eager in a way that ranch life hadn't beaten out of him yet. Mrs. Callahan, he said, setting down the last crock. Can I ask you something? You can ask, she said. Why do you write everything down? She looked at him. He was 17 and genuinely curious, not trying to be difficult. Because memory is unreliable, she said. And people with power count on that. They count on you not being able to prove what you know is true. Pete thought about that. That sounds like something bad happened, he said. It did, she said. To my family. He nodded slowly, the way young people nod when they're trying to understand something heavier than their experience has prepared them for. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be sorry, Clara said. Learn from it. She handed him a biscuit from the pan she'd pulled out 5 minutes ago because she had learned that Pete was always hungry and always too proud to ask, and she had decided some time ago to simply not make him ask. I took it, and his face did the thing it always did, a brief helpless gratitude that was too young to hide itself. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Go on," she said. "You've got fence work before dark." He went. She watched him go and felt something settle in her chest. Not quite happiness, but something adjacent to it. The particular satisfaction of a system working the way it was supposed to. It was the same afternoon that Elias Boone came to find her. He came the way he always came, without announcement, appearing in the kitchen doorway. The way old men who've worked a property for 30 years appear in places as if the land itself had grown him there. He was 71 years old, Elias, though you'd never get him to admit it. And he had seen every incarnation of the Callahan Ranch, from the original 300 acres to the sprawling operation it was now. He stood in the doorway and watched her work for a moment. "You heard about the Granger property," he said. It wasn't a question, but it was also a test. She could hear that. "May mentioned it," Clara said. She kept her hands moving. "The Grangers are behind on their bank payment, 3 months. Grayson's been in to see the bank manager twice this week." Clara stopped. She turned around. "Which bank?" "Harlan Creek Savings." He paused. "Same man who handles Callahan accounts." She looked at him steadily. "And what is Grayson planning to do with the Granger land if he gets it?" Elias met her eyes. He had been watching her for 6 weeks now, carefully and without apparent expression, and she understood that this moment, him coming to tell her this, coming to her instead of to Nathaniel, was a form of verdict. "The Granger property runs along the south boundary of the northwest quarter," Elias said. "If Grayson owns it, he controls access to the water rights on the creek bend." Clara turned that over in her mind. Once. Twice. "And the northwest quarter is what Grayson's been trying to buy from Mr. Callahan for 2 years, she said. "Yes, ma'am." "So he doesn't need to buy it outright if he can make it worthless by cutting off the water." "That's how I read it," Elias said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does Mr. Callahan know about the Grangers?" "He knows they're behind. He doesn't know about Grayson's visits to the bank." "How do you know about them?" Elias allowed a very small, very dry expression to cross his face. "I've been in this valley 40 years, Mrs. Callahan. The bank manager's wife buys her flour from a woman who sells to the mercantile. Word travels." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Boone," she said, "why did you come to me with this instead of Mr. Callahan?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was deciding how honest to be. "Because," he said finally, "Nate would ride into town and have a conversation with Grayson that would make things worse. You'll think about it first." She didn't say anything to that. "Also," Elias said, and for just a second, something shifted in the old man's face. Something that looked almost like approval, though it was so brief she might have imagined it. "You already know something's wrong with that land deal. I can tell by the way you looked just now." Clara turned back to the counter. "Tell me the Grangers' names," she said, "and how much they're behind." Elias told her. She wrote it down. She needed to think, and she thought best when her hands were moving, so she went back to the bread she had been making and worked through the dough in long, rhythmic strokes and let the problem arrange itself in her mind, the way problems did when you gave them room. The Grangers were Tom and Ruth Granger, 53 and 48, who had worked their property for 20 years and raised 4 children on it. They were behind 3 months on a loan that had been refinanced once already, which meant the bank had already shown patience once, and Grayson had probably been watching that situation for a while, waiting for the right moment to step in. The water rights on the creek bend at the south end of the Granger property were not something most people would think to value until they needed them. But someone who wanted to pressure a neighboring ranch owner into selling a piece of land he'd refused to sell would think to value them, would plan around them. She punched the dough down. She needed to talk to Ruth Granger. She also needed to be very careful about how she did that, because the last thing she wanted was for Grayson to hear that Callahan's wife was asking questions. Not yet. She needed to not be Callahan's wife for this particular conversation. She needed to just be Clara. She found May Watkins the next morning. "I need to visit the Grangers," she said, "and I need it to be a neighborly visit, a social call, nothing that looks like business." May looked at her. "You've been here 7 weeks." "I know. You've never made a social call on anyone." "I know that too." May was quiet for a beat. "What are you after?" "I'm not sure yet," Clara said. "I need to talk to Ruth Granger. I need to understand what she knows about the situation with the bank." "And you think she'll talk to you?" "Women talk to other women," Clara said, "especially when they're frightened and no one else is listening." May looked at her a long moment. Then she stood up from the table. "I'll drive you over this afternoon," she said. "I'll tell Ruth you make good biscuits. It's not even a lie." Ruth Granger was a thin woman with strong hands and the particular expression of someone who had been managing fear for long enough that it had become a permanent feature of her face. She sat across from Clara at her kitchen table and talked about the weather and the cattle prices and the state of the road into town, and Clara listened to all of it and said the right things and ate the slice of pie Ruth cut for her and did not ask about the bank for a full hour. Then very quietly she said, "Ruth, how long has Grayson been pressuring you?" Ruth went still. May, sitting in the corner with her own slice of pie, did not move. Clara kept her voice gentle, level. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said. "But I think you should. I think there's more happening here than a missed loan payment, and I think you know it, and I think you've been trying to figure out what to do about it alone." Ruth looked down at her hands. For a moment, Clara thought she might not speak at all. Then Ruth said, "He came to us in August, before we were even behind, offered to buy the property outright. Tom said no." She paused. "A month later, the bank told us they were adjusting the loan terms. Interest went up. Payment went up. Tom went in to talk to the manager, and the manager said there'd been a review of the loan terms, said it was standard." She looked up. "It wasn't standard. We had that loan for 6 years, and the terms never changed once." Clara kept her expression steady. "Do you have the original loan documents?" "Tom kept everything." "Can I see them?" Ruth stared at her. "Why?" "Because I want to know exactly what the bank can and cannot legally do to your loan," Clara said. "And I want to know before Grayson does something that's harder to reverse." There was a long silence. May Watkins in the corner set down her pie fork. Ruth Granger looked at Clara Whitfield. This woman she'd known for an hour. This mail-order bride from Missouri, who everyone in town had already written off, and something in her face shifted. Not hope exactly. Something more cautious than hope. More careful. "You think you can stop him," Ruth said. "I think someone needs to understand what he's actually doing before he finishes doing it," Clara said. "That's the first step." Ruth went to get the documents. Clara spent 2 hours at that table reading through 6 years of loan records, and what she found made her hand tighten around the pencil hard enough that she had to consciously loosen her grip. The original loan terms were clear. The adjusted terms the bank had applied, the ones that had pushed the Grangers behind, were applied without the written notification required under the loan agreement. It was a small thing, a procedural thing, the kind of detail that only mattered if someone was paying close enough attention to know it mattered. Most people weren't. Most people trusted the bank to follow its own rules because the bank was the bank, and who was a farming family in Wyoming territory to argue with a bank? Clara wrote down every relevant date, every relevant clause, every discrepancy she could find. Her handwriting was very small and very even, and she filled 2 pages of her notebook before she was done. She looked up at Ruth. "Can I take copies of the original loan agreement?" "What are you going to do with them?" "I'm going to find out whether what the bank did to your loan was legal," Clara said. "And if it wasn't, I'm going to make sure someone knows that." "Who?" Ruth said. "Who's going to care? Mrs. Callahan Grayson has the bank manager in his pocket. Tom already tried talking to the sheriff. The sheriff said it was a civil matter." "It is a civil matter," Clara said, "which means it goes to a court, not to a sheriff." She paused. "I'm not promising you anything, Ruth. I want to be clear about that. I'm saying I'm going to look at this carefully, and if there's something here, and I believe there is, I'm going to find it." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "How do you know how to do any of this?" Clara folded her notebook carefully. She thought of the letters in the oilcloth packet still hidden inside the wooden box. She thought of her father's face the day the banker sent the final notice. She thought of her mother, who had cooked and preserved and stretched and managed and worked herself to exhaustion for 30 years and died with nothing to show for it because someone with more power and less conscience had decided the rules didn't apply to him. "Someone did something like this to my family," she said. "I didn't know enough to stop it then." She looked at Ruth. "I know more now." She rode back to the Callahan ranch with May Watkins in the gathering dark, and she was quiet the whole way, turning things over in her mind, and May had the good sense not to break the silence. When they pulled up to the ranch, Nathaniel was in the yard talking to Elias. He looked up when he saw the wagon. His eyes went to Clara. She climbed down, thanked May, and carried her things toward the house. "Clara!" Nathaniel's voice stopped her at the kitchen door. She turned. He crossed the yard toward her, close enough that she could see his face clearly in the last of the evening light. He was reading her expression, the way she had noticed he read things carefully, trying to get the true meaning rather than just the surface. "Where did you go today?" he said. "To visit Ruth Granger," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "May took you." "Yes." "Why the Grangers?" She looked at him steadily. "Because Grayson is maneuvering to take their property, and their property runs along your south boundary, and if he gets the water rights at the creek bend, he has leverage over your northwest quarter that you cannot easily fight with money alone." She paused. "You need to know what he's actually doing, Mr. Callahan. Not just that he's asking about fence lines." Nathaniel was very still. "And what did you find?" he said quietly. "The bank changed the Grangers' loan terms without proper written notice," she said. "It may not be legal. I need someone with legal training to look at what I found, but the documents suggest the bank violated the original agreement." "You think Grayson is behind that?" "I think Grayson has been planning this for longer than anyone realized," she said. "And I think he's been patient because he expected nobody would put it together in time." Nathaniel looked at her. He was not a man who showed surprise often. She could see him working against it now. "Clara," he said, and his voice had dropped to something quieter, something she hadn't heard from him before. "Who are you?" She held his gaze. "I'm the woman you told your foreman you'd send back in a month," she said. He didn't flinch at that, but she saw something move across his face. "You heard that." "I heard it." "I'm Mr. Callahan." She cut him off not unkindly. "I didn't come here to hold that against you. I came here to be useful. That's what I'm being." She paused. "But I need something from you." "What?" "I need you to trust what I've found," she said. "Not because you believe I'm capable, though I hope that's becoming clearer, but because there isn't time for you to verify everything yourself before Grayson makes his next move." He was quiet for a long moment. The cold was settling around them. The sky above the ranch going the particular blue of early winter dusk, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, someone had started up a fiddle faint and distant. "What do you need me to do?" Nathaniel said. Clara told him. Over the following week, things moved quickly, the way things move when they've been building slowly for a long time and finally have somewhere to go. Nathaniel sent a letter to an attorney in Cheyenne he had used twice before for property matters. A man named Aldrich, who was precise and unpleasant and thorough, which were exactly the qualities you wanted in this situation. Clara drafted the relevant sections of the letter, laying out the loan discrepancy, in language she hoped was clear enough for a lawyer who hadn't seen the documents. She also quietly did something else. She started talking to the other ranch wives. Not about Grayson. Not directly. She started the way she started everything, by listening. By asking about their winters, their kitchens, their stores. By sharing what she was doing with the Callahan pantry system and inviting them to try elements of it themselves. 3 women came by the ranch on separate occasions that week, drawn by May Watkins's casual recommendations. And Clara sat them down with coffee and talked about supply management and food preservation and the particular challenge of feeding large households on irregular budgets. And while they talked, she learned. She learned which families were in Walter Grayson's debt for labor or loans or supplies. She learned which properties he'd made offers on in the past 3 years and which had turned him down. She learned from a woman named Helen Briggs, whose husband worked as a freight driver for one of Grayson's operations, that there had been 2 other properties in the valley where the bank had adjusted loan terms under similar circumstances, both of which Grayson had subsequently acquired. 2 others. She wrote it all down. It was on a Wednesday, 12 days after her visit to the Grangers, that Walter Grayson came back to the Callahan Ranch. This time he came to the front door, and this time Nathaniel was the one who answered it. Clara was in the kitchen and could not hear the conversation, but she could hear the shape of it. 2 men's voices, one controlled, one with an edge that wanted to be easy and wasn't quite managing it. After 20 minutes, the front door closed. Nathaniel came into the kitchen. He sat down at the table. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat across from him. "He made an offer on the northwest quarter," Nathaniel said. "More than fair market value." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." Clara looked at him. "You're not going to sell?" "No," he said. "I'm not. But I want him to think I am." He paused. "That was your suggestion? From 2 weeks ago?" "It was." "You were right about the water rights," he said. "Aldrich wrote back this morning. He says if Grayson gets the Granger property and records a water rights claim on the creek bend, it creates a legitimate legal question about access to the northwest quarter. It wouldn't be open and shut for Grayson, but it would be expensive and slow to fight." "Expensive and slow are how men like Grayson win," Clara said. "Yes." He looked at his coffee. "Aldrich also said the loan modification on the Granger account looks improper. He wants the original documents." "I have copies," Clara said. "I can have them ready by morning." Nathaniel looked at her across the table. That look she was beginning to recognize, the careful recalibrating look. "You had copies made." "When I visited Ruth Granger," she said, "I thought we might need them." He was quiet. "You thought about this before you knew whether I'd even act on it," he said. "I thought about what could go wrong and tried to prevent it," she said. "That's different from assuming." Another silence. This one different from the silences that had come before. Warmer somehow. More inhabited. "Clara," he said. He stopped. Tried again. "I owe you an apology." She met his eyes. "When you arrived," he said, and his voice had that particular difficulty of a man who does not apologize often and is doing it anyway. "I made a judgment. I looked at you, and I decided what you were, before you'd said 20 words to me." He paused. "That was wrong." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "It was." He nodded once, not minimizing it, just accepting the truth of what she'd said. "Are you going to help the Grangers?" she said. "That's what you want. They're good people in a bad situation that someone else manufactured," she said. "They shouldn't lose 20 years of work because Walter Grayson is patient and the bank manager is dishonest." "It's going to cost me," he said. "Legally if Aldrich has to fight the bank, and with Grayson because he'll know I was involved." "I know," Clara said. "And you still think it's right?" "Don't you?" He looked at her. The fiddle had started up again out in the bunkhouse, the same wandering tune as before, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like bread and coffee and the particular cedar smell of the wood they were burning. Nathaniel Callahan picked up his coffee cup. He did not answer immediately. He turned the cup in his hands once, twice the way he handled things he was thinking hard about. Then he said, "Write up what we have, all of it, everything you found. I'll send it to Aldrich with the copies tomorrow morning." Clara reached for her notebook. She was already writing before the sentence was finished. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall quietly, without announcement, settling over the valley and the ranch and the mountains beyond, with the patient indifference of a Wyoming winter that does not care what you are in the middle of, or how much you still have left to do. Clara didn't look out at it. She had work to finish. And somewhere between the careful lines of her notebook, between the dates and the clauses and the documented facts that she was building into something, a dishonest man would not be able to simply dismiss. She felt something clarify in her chest. Not quite relief. Not quite confidence. The particular quiet steadiness that comes when you understand that the thing you have been building slowly, carefully, from what you had, rather than what you wished for, is solid enough to stand on, she wrote. The snow fell, and Nathaniel Callahan, who had not once in 12 years of building an empire allowed himself to rely on another person's thinking, sat across from his wife and did not leave the table until everything was finished. Aldrich's reply came on a Friday, and it was not good news. Not bad news either. That was the particular torture of it. It was the kind of legal correspondence that says everything is possible and nothing is certain, and the only guarantee is that it will take time. The bank had, in Aldrich's careful professional opinion, likely overstepped in modifying the Granger loan without proper written notification. Likely. Possibly. Pending review of the original charter documents and the specific statutes applicable to territorial banking institutions, which he was in the process of obtaining, which would take another 3 to 4 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks. Clara read the letter twice, folded it precisely along its original creases, and set it on the table. Then she got up and went back to the stove, because the soup she was making for lunch would not wait for legal timelines. Nathaniel came in from the barn, 20 minutes later, stamping mud off his boots, and she handed him the letter without speaking. He read it standing up still in his coat, and his jaw did the thing it did when he was holding back a reaction he'd decided wasn't useful. 3 weeks, he said. Maybe 4. And in 3 weeks Grayson could have already made his move on the Granger property. Yes, Clara said. Which is why we're not waiting on Aldrich. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means, she said, that there is more than one way to protect those people. She stirred the soup without looking at him. Grayson needs the bank. He needs the bank to call in the Granger's loan, so the property goes to foreclosure and he can buy it at the sheriff's sale. If the Grangers aren't in default, the bank has no grounds to foreclose. No foreclosure, no sheriff's sale, no Grayson. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Clara, the Grangers are 3 months behind. We'd have to cover the arrears, she said. Yes. That's not a small number. I know what the number is, she said. She looked at him now. I also know that if Grayson gets that property and files a water rights claim on the creek bend before Aldrich can establish the loan modification was improper, you'll spend 5 times that amount fighting it in court, and you might not win. The silence stretched. She went back to the soup. You've already worked out the figures, he said. Last night. Of course you did. He set the letter down. She heard him cross the room, heard him pull out the chair across from her usual spot at the table and sit down. What's the number? She told him. He didn't flinch. She had expected him to flinch, and he didn't, and she filed that away as information worth keeping. If I cover the Granger's arrears, he said slowly, Grayson will know. He'll find out eventually, Clara said. The question is whether he finds out before or after Aldrich gets back to us with something we can actually use. She paused. I'd rather he find out after. How do you keep it quiet? Tom Granger goes to the bank and makes the payment himself, she said. Cash. He doesn't say where it came from. The bank records show the loan is current. Grayson has nothing to work with. Nathaniel looked at her. And Tom agrees to this. I haven't asked him yet, Clara said. I wanted to talk to you first. Something flickered in his expression. Something brief that she was becoming better at reading. Appreciation, she thought. Not for the plan necessarily, though she believed the plan was sound. For the fact that she had come to him first. That she had treated this as a shared decision rather than something she would simply do. Tom Granger is a proud man, Nathaniel said. Yes. He may not take money from a neighbor. He might take a loan from a neighbor, Clara said. At fair terms, written down properly, which is more than the bank gave him. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, set up the meeting. She did. Tom Granger came to the ranch on Sunday, and he came the way proud men come to ask for things they need, hat in hand and jaw set, and eyes that looked everywhere except directly at the man whose help he required. He was a big man, Tom, with the kind of face that work had written all over, and he sat at Clara's kitchen table and held his coffee with both hands and did not speak for the first several minutes. Nathaniel sat across from him. Clara sat at the end of the table and did not say anything, because this moment did not belong to her. Finally, Nathaniel said, "I'm going to be straight with you, Tom. What Grayson is doing to you, he's doing to me too. Just slower. If he gets your property and those water rights, I've got a problem I can't easily fix. So helping you isn't charity, it's sense." Tom looked at his coffee. "I've got my pride," Tom said. "I know that," Nathaniel said. "I don't want my wife knowing we couldn't handle our own business." "Ruth already knows," Clara said gently. "She's the one keeping track of the documents. She's the one who showed them to me. She's been carrying this alone so you wouldn't have to, Tom. She's been trying to protect you." Tom went very still. Clara watched the realization move through him, the specific, complicated hurt of discovering that the person you were protecting had been protecting you back and that you had both been suffering separately when you didn't have to. He looked down. "Lord," he said quietly. "You can pay me back," Nathaniel said. "Same rate you had on the original loan before the bank changed it. No hurry, no games." He paused. "But we need to move this week, before Grayson figures out what we're doing." Tom looked up. His eyes were red around the rims, but his jaw was steady. "Why are you doing this, Nate?" "Nate, we've never been." He stopped. "We've never been particularly close." Nathaniel glanced at Clara just for a second, just long enough. "I had someone explain to me recently that a kitchen isn't just a place where food gets made," he said. "I'm starting to think the same thing is true of a valley." Tom Granger looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. "All right," Tom said. "All right, I'll go to the bank Monday." He went to the bank Monday. Grayson found out by Wednesday. Clara knew the moment she saw Nathaniel's face when he came in from town that afternoon, and she knew from the set of his shoulders that whatever had happened was more than she had anticipated. "He went to the sheriff," Nathaniel said. He sat down at the table and put his hat on the surface with more force than necessary. "Grayson went to the sheriff and claimed I'm interfering in a private banking matter, using my position to manipulate a legal financial process." Clara sat down across from him. "On what grounds?" "There aren't grounds, not real ones. But the sheriff came out to talk to me anyway, and the whole town saw it, and that's the point." His jaw was tight. "He doesn't need to win in court, Clara. He just needs people to think there's something wrong with what we're doing." "What did you tell the sheriff?" "The truth. That I made a private loan to a neighbor at fair terms. That there's nothing illegal about that." He paused. The sheriff agreed. He apologized. "He's not Grayson's man." "I want to be clear about that. But Grayson knows how to use even a friendly sheriff as a tool." Clara was quiet for a moment. Her mind was moving fast, sorting through implications. "What's Grayson telling people?" she said. "That you put me up to it," Nathaniel said. "That you've been meddling in ranch business since you arrived. That a woman from Missouri who doesn't know a fence post from a fence line is making decisions that affect the whole valley." Clara absorbed that. "He's trying to make this about me," she said. "Yes. He thinks if he discredits me, the information we've gathered loses weight." "That's how I read it," Nathaniel said. He looked at her. "I told him I told everyone who'd listen that you're my wife, and anything you've done has been done with my full knowledge and support." "Thank you." "I mean it, Clara. I'm not just saying it to protect you." "I know," she said, and she did know. She had been watching this man for nearly 2 months, and she had learned to tell the difference between what he said to manage a situation and what he said because it was simply true. This was the latter. "The problem," she said carefully, "is that Grayson is right about one thing." Nathaniel looked at her. "The people in this valley don't know me," she said. "They know what they saw when I stepped off that stagecoach. They know what he's been saying since then. I haven't given them enough to counter that with." She paused. "I've been working inward, building things here on the ranch, working with May and Ruth. I haven't built anything outward." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she said slowly, "that we need to change that. And I think I know how." She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she had learned was his highest form of attention. When she finished, he said, "That's ambitious." "Yes. If it doesn't work." "It'll work," she said. "Not arrogance. Something quieter than arrogance. Certainty built from knowledge of what she actually had. He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. What Clara proposed was simple in concept and complicated in execution, which was her preferred kind of plan. She was going to open the ranch kitchen. Not literally, not permanently. But on the following Saturday, she was going to cook. She was going to cook the way her mother had taught her to cook, when there were 12 people at the table, and only money for 6, with intelligence and creativity, and the particular grace that comes from understanding how to make people feel that what they have is enough. She was going to invite every woman in the valley whose kitchen she had visited, or whose husband worked land that touched Callahan ground, or whose name had come up in any conversation over the past 8 weeks, and she was going to show them, not tell them, show them what she had been doing on this ranch. The supplies system, the preservation methods, the rotation calendar she'd built that had cut waste by 1/3 since October. The way a kitchen managed well was not just a domestic matter, but an economic one. The difference between a ranch family that survived a hard winter and one that didn't. And while she showed them all of that, while the kitchen filled up with women who were curious and cautious and had heard Walter Grayson's version of who Clara Whitfield was, she was going to let them form their own opinion. "He's been talking about what I can't do," she told May Watkins, who arrived early on Friday to help her prepare. "I'm going to let them see what I can." May rolled up her sleeves. "Tell me what you need." What followed was the 2 most productive days of work Clara had done since arriving in Wyoming, which was saying something. She and May worked through Friday in the Callahan kitchen, and Pete helped carry, and Elias appeared twice to silently move heavy things without being asked. And by Friday night, every surface was organized. Every supply was laid out with purpose, and the kitchen smelled like something between a bakery and a home. Saturday morning, the women came. 11 of them from 7 different properties across the valley. They came the way women come to things they're not sure about. Careful measuring, ready to be polite, but not ready to be convinced. Helen Briggs came, whose husband worked Grayson's freight routes. The Dawson sisters came together, which meant their mother had sent them to report back. Ruth Granger came, and she came with her chin up and her hands steady, and Clara loved her for that. Clara did not make a speech. She made biscuits. She stood at the counter and made biscuits the way her mother had made them, talking while her hands moved, explaining not just the recipe, but the logic underneath it. Why the fat temperature mattered. How to tell when flour had been stored wrong by the weight of it in your hand. What to do when you were out of the ingredient you needed and had to build from what you had. She talked about waste, the way she talked about everything plainly without judgment, with complete respect for the intelligence of the women listening. She put the figures on the table. Real numbers. What a family of 5 could save in a year with a proper pantry rotation. What that number meant in winter terms, in weeks of food security, in the difference between scraping through January and entering March with something left over. Helen Briggs asked the first real question about 40 minutes in. "Where did you learn all this?" she said. Not hostile, genuinely curious. "My mother," Clara said. "And necessity." She paused. "We had very little when I was growing up. My mother learned to make a kitchen work the way a good foreman makes a ranch work. Every resource accounted for, nothing wasted, every person fed." "You grew up poor," Helen said. "Yes." Helen looked at the organized pantry, the inventory sheets, the careful rows of sealed preserves. "And now you're managing this." "I'm managing what I know how to manage," Clara said. "The size of the kitchen changes. The principles don't." Ruth Granger from the far end of the table said quietly, "She also knows what Walter Grayson is doing to this valley." The room went very still. Clara looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at her steady. "Tell them," Ruth said. "Tell them what you found." Clara set down the biscuit she was shaping. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the women around her table, 11 faces ranging from guarded to frightened to carefully blank, and she made a decision. She told them. She told them about the Granger loan documents, about the improper modification, about the 2 other properties in the valley where the bank had done the same thing, the Morrison place, which Grayson had bought at foreclosure 3 years ago. the old Hendricks farm, which had been sold under pressure 2 years before that. She put the pattern on the table the way she put her figures on the table plainly, without embellishment, with every date and name accounted for. She told them about Aldrich, about the legal question around the loan modification, about what the water rights on the Granger Creek Bend would mean for access to the northwest quarter of the Callahan property. And then she said the thing she had been building toward. He's doing this quietly, she said, because quiet is how it works. Each family thinks their situation is separate. Each farm thinks it's a private matter between themselves and the bank. Nobody sees the whole picture because nobody has been talking to each other. She paused. I've been talking to each other for 8 weeks. And what I see is a man who has been acquiring this valley one piece at a time, using a banker who does what he's told, and counting on good people keeping their troubles to themselves. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Then Helen Briggs said very quietly, "The Morrison place." Clara looked at her. "My husband drove freight for Grayson when he was getting the Morrison property," Helen said. "I always thought there was something wrong with how fast it happened. Archie, my husband. He said Grayson knew the sale was coming before the Morrisons even knew they were going to sell." Her voice had gone flat, with something that was trying to be anger and hadn't quite got there yet because it was still fighting past shock. "He knew." "Yes," Clara said. "He knew because he arranged it." Helen put her hand flat on the table. Not a dramatic gesture, just a woman steadying herself. "The Dawson girl on the left." Emma, the younger one, said, "What can we do?" Clara looked at her. 20 years old maybe, with her mother's practical eyes. "You can talk to each other," Clara said. "You can stop treating this as a collection of separate private problems and start treating it as what it is, a community problem that requires a community response." She paused. "And if any of your families have documentation, any correspondence with the bank that seemed wrong, any loan adjustments that didn't feel right, I'd like to see it." 3 women in 3 different corners of that kitchen exchanged glances with each other. 3. Clara saw it and kept her expression calm, but something in her chest pulled taut like a wire. 3 families. Not 2. 3 at minimum. Possibly more. She had undercounted how far Grayson had reached. That was when the door opened. Not the kitchen door. The front door, which was visible through the hallway, and which nobody was supposed to be coming through on a Saturday morning without an invitation. Nathaniel appeared in the kitchen doorway a moment later, and his face was the face of a man who had just received information that had rearranged something in his understanding. "Clara," he said, "I need you for a moment." She excused herself, stepped into the hallway. "Grayson is at the bank right now," Nathaniel said low and fast. "My man in town just rode out. He's filing some kind of formal complaint against the Granger loan claiming interference in a banking matter. If it gets recorded, it creates a paper trail that makes the loan look contested," Clara said immediately. "Even if it doesn't hold up legally, it gives him grounds to delay," she said. "To delay Aldrich, to delay the Grangers, to create enough legal fog that the bank can move on the foreclosure before anyone clears it." She was already thinking. Her mind had that particular speed it got when the stakes sharpened everything. When did he file? An hour ago, maybe less. Does Aldrich know? I sent a rider to the telegraph office in town. Good. She looked at him. I need you to do something, and I need you to trust me. When have I not trusted you? He said. She looked at him for just a second, caught briefly by that, by the plain truth of it. I need you to go to the Grangers right now, she said. Take the original loan agreement and the copy of the improper modification notice. I need Tom to go with you to the telegraph office and send Aldrich every document today. Not Monday, today. It's Saturday. I know. Aldrich gave me his home address in the last letter. You'll send it there as well. Nathaniel grabbed his hat. What are you going to do? Finish making biscuits, she said, and let 11 women decide what kind of valley they want to live in. He was out the door before she'd finished the sentence. She went back into the kitchen. 11 faces looked at her. She picked up the biscuit she'd set down and resumed shaping it with steady hands. I apologize for the interruption, she said. Now, who else has documentation they'd like me to look at? 3 women spoke at once. Clara worked through lunch and into the afternoon, and the kitchen table disappeared under papers that the women of the valley had been holding on to, some for months, some for years. Documents they had kept because something had felt wrong and they hadn't known what to do with that feeling. Loan notices, letters from the bank, a purchase offer from Grayson with a date that Clara noted with precise fury, predated by 6 weeks the financial difficulty that had supposedly forced the sale. 6 weeks. He had written the offer before the difficulty existed, because he had created the difficulty. She documented everything. 2 pages of notes turned to 5, then to 7, and her handwriting got smaller and faster as the afternoon went on, and not once did her hand shake. Ruth Granger sat beside her and helped sort. Helen Briggs, who had gone quiet but not left, eventually stood up, went to the stove and made a fresh pot of coffee for everyone without being asked. Clara watched it happen, this woman who had come to this kitchen uncertain and suspicious, now moving through it like she belonged there, and felt something expand in her chest. This was what she'd been trying to build. Not just a pantry system, not just a kitchen. This. At 4 o'clock, Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway, wide-eyed at the collection of women filling every available surface. "Ma'am, there's a rider coming in fast from town." Clara stood up. The rider was from Nathaniel. A folded note tucked in the man's coat pocket. She opened it. Nathaniel's handwriting was spare and direct, like everything else about him. Aldrich received the telegraph. Sending a colleague to file injunction Monday morning. Grayson's complaint may not hold. Coming back now. Are you all right? The last 3 words. She read them twice. She turned the paper over and wrote on the back, "I'm fine. Kitchen is full. Come hungry." She handed it back to the rider. She went back inside. And then the weather changed. It had been threatening for 3 days, the sky doing the particular thing Wyoming skies did before a serious storm going, that flat, colorless gray that didn't look like much but felt like a held breath. Clara had been watching it. She had been watching it and calculating the way she calculated everything, and she had moved supplies, and she had prepared, but she had not spoken of it because there was enough happening, and she hadn't wanted to create alarm before she knew the shape of the thing. Now she knew the shape. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in an hour. She could feel it through the walls. The first woman to notice was Emma Dawson, who looked at the window and went still. "That's coming fast," she said. "Yes," Clara said. "My family's property is 2 miles east," Emma said. "If that's what I think it is." "It is," Clara said. "How much do you have put up for winter?" Emma hesitated. "We thought we had enough, but we had a problem with the root cellar last month. Some of the stores went bad." "How many people?" 7. "My parents, me and my sister, and 3 hands." Clara was already moving. She went to the pantry, the organized, carefully rotated, precisely documented pantry that she had spent 8 weeks building, and she started pulling. The other women watched for approximately 4 seconds. Then Ruth Granger stood up and said, "Tell me what you need." And Helen Briggs said, "I know how to pack preserves for transport." And the third woman, whose name was Alice, and who had barely spoken all afternoon, said, "I've got 2 horses tied outside. They can carry weight." The kitchen became something different then. It became what Clara's mother had always said. A good kitchen could become not just a place where a family survived, but a place where a community did. She directed, and the women moved, and in 40 minutes they had packed enough preserved food, dried goods, and sealed crocks to see the Dawson family through 2 weeks of the worst Wyoming could offer. Emma Dawson stood in the doorway with her arms full and her eyes bright and said, "Mrs. Callahan, I don't know how to—" "Don't thank me," Clara said. "Thank your neighbors. And next time someone in this valley needs something, you remember today." Emma nodded fast and went. The other women began talking about their own situations. Who had enough? Who was short? Who had neighbors who were older and might need checking on? Clara listened and took notes and helped them think through what they had collectively, because collectively they had more than any of them individually, which was the thing nobody had ever sat down to calculate before. Nathaniel came in through the kitchen door at 5:30 to find 8 women still at his kitchen table, his wife at the center of it with her notebook and her steady voice, and the warm, purposeful, slightly chaotic energy of people working on a problem together, filling every corner of the room. He stopped. He stood in the doorway, and Clara looked up at him, and for just a moment, one unguarded moment, between a woman who had spent her whole life proving herself, and a man who had spent his whole life doubting everyone, they simply looked at each other across that full, warm humming room. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. But his face did something she had never seen it do before. It went soft. Not weak, not sentimental. Just open. In the way a door goes open when someone finally finds the right key. He hung up his hat and coat on the nail by the door. He washed his hands at the basin. He turned and looked at May Watkins. "May, are you staying for supper?" "Wasn't planning to turn down a meal in this kitchen," May said. "Then you'd better set more places," he said, "because it looks like we've got a few extra." He said it easily, naturally, as if a kitchen full of his neighbors' wives working through a crisis together on a Saturday afternoon was simply the way things were supposed to be. Clara watched him pull out a chair and sit down at the end of the table, already reaching for the inventory notes nearest to him, already reading, already engaging, already without fanfare or formal declaration treating this as his problem too. She looked back down at her notebook. She wrote Saturday, November 29. Storm incoming. Community stores distributed. Documentation sent to Aldrich. She paused. Then she wrote 8 women at the table. Something has shifted. She underlined it. Outside the wind picked up hard and fast, and the first snow began to come sideways, and the storm that would go on to be remembered as the worst Wyoming had seen in 11 years began with the particular indifference of weather that does not know or care that it has chosen the worst possible moment and the absolute best one to arrive. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of wind that came down off the mountains with the kind of force that made the walls of the Callahan Ranch house groan at 2 in the morning, that piled snow against the barn doors until 3 men had to push together to open them, that turned the 6 miles between the ranch and Harlan Creek into something that could not be crossed without risking a life. 4 days during which the valley went quiet, in the particular way it goes quiet, when nature reminds everyone living in it that all their plans and schemes and carefully constructed arrangements are ultimately subject to approval by something much larger than themselves. Clara did not sleep more than 4 hours on any of those nights. The women who had been at the kitchen table when the storm arrived, May, Ruth, Helen, Alice, and Emma's sister Josephine, who had come in behind the storm looking for Emma and ended up staying, had all remained on the ranch because there was no sensible alternative. Nathaniel had set them up in the 2 spare rooms on the upper floor without discussion, simply telling Pete to bring extra blankets and informing Clara that the situation was what it was and they would manage. They managed. The kitchen became the center of everything. The way kitchens do in a crisis. The room everyone drifted toward because it was warm, and because something was always being done there, and because the particular smell of food being prepared is one of the oldest forms of reassurance the human animal has. Clara kept the stove burning through the night. She rotated the cooking so that nobody had to stand at it alone for more than 2 hours. She did the calculations constantly in her head, and on paper tracking what they had, and what they were using, and how long it would last if the storm went 5 days instead of 4 or 6 instead of 5. On the second night, Nathaniel found her at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with her notebook and the pantry inventory spread across the surface, and a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink. He sat down across from her without being invited, which was something he had started doing somewhere in the past week without either of them remarking on it. "How are we doing?" he said. "Well," she said. "Better than well, actually. The rotation system means we're not pulling from the wrong stores." She turned the inventory sheet so he could see it. "If this goes 6 days, we're still in good shape. 7 gets tight but manageable. Beyond that, we'd need to be more careful." He looked at the sheet. "You thought about 7 days." "I always think about the worst case," she said. "Then I work backwards from it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's how I run the ranch," he said. "I know," she said. "I noticed." He looked at her across the table. The oil lamp between them made the shadows move slowly, and the wind outside was doing its 4 in the morning howl, and somewhere above them in the spare room, They could hear May Watkins's distinct and entirely unapologetic snoring. "What are you worried about?" he said. She looked up from the inventory. "The Hendersons," she said. "The property northeast of the Dawsons. Older couple from what May told me. She mentioned them in passing last week, said they'd had trouble with their seller too, same as the Dawsons, but she didn't think they'd said anything to anyone." "Jim Henderson," Nathaniel said. 70 years old, his wife Margaret. "They've been out there since before I was born." "If they didn't have enough put up before this storm hit." "I know." He looked at the window. "I can't get a rider out there in this." "I know that too," she said. "I'm just telling you what I'm worried about, so that when it clears, that's the first place we go." He looked at her. That look, the one she'd been watching evolve over 2.5 months from closed assessment to something she still didn't have a precise name for, but that felt increasingly like being genuinely seen. He said. "I'd like to come," she said. "I know what to bring." He nodded once. "All right." She reached for a cold coffee, remembered. It was cold, set it back down. He stood up, went to the stove, poured a fresh cup from the pot she kept on low heat through the nights, and set it in front of her. Then he poured one for himself and sat back down. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that is not small at all. Clara wrapped her hands around the cup. "Tell me about Jim Henderson," she said. And Nathaniel talked. Not the way he usually talked, measured, efficient information, stripped of everything except its utility. He talked the way people talk at 3 in the morning during a storm, when the walls are close and the world outside has narrowed to a point, and there's nothing to do but wait and be honest. He told her about Henderson's ranch, as it had been 30 years ago, and as it was now. About Jim's son, who had gone to California and never come back. About Margaret's garden, which was the best kitchen garden in the valley, which she had maintained for 40 years. About the particular way the old couple had become over time part of the landscape of this valley, the kind of people whose continued presence nobody thought about because they had always been there, and whose absence would only be noticed terribly and too late after they were gone. Clara listened. She did not take notes this time. Some things didn't need to be written down. The storm broke on the morning of the 4th day, with the abrupt, almost startling clarity that follows serious weather. The sky going from iron gray to a blue so clean and cold. It almost hurt the wind dropping away so suddenly that the silence felt loud. Clara was already up. She heard it change, and stood at the kitchen window and looked at what the storm had left, and then she went to get her coat. Nathaniel was in the barn when she found him. He was already saddling horses. He looked up when she came in. "I'll take Pete and Harlan," he said. "You're right about the Hendersons. We should—" "Take me instead of Harlan," she said. "I know what we're looking for, and I can help Margaret if she needs it in ways that Pete and Harlan can't." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. "Can you ride?" "I grew up in Missouri," she said. "Not a city." The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "Right," he said. They rode out with Pete, the 3 of them, and Clara kept her horse steady and her eyes forward, and did not mention that she hadn't ridden regularly in 2 years, because this was not the moment for that information. The Henderson property was an hour's ride northeast, and they covered it in 45 minutes because Nathaniel set a pace that didn't invite discussion. When they arrived, Jim Henderson opened the door before they knocked, which meant he had seen them coming from a window and had been watching for them. He was a tall man made smaller by age with white hair and the eyes of someone who had been doing quiet arithmetic about provisions for the last 4 days and had not liked the answers. He looked at Nathaniel. Then he looked at Clara. "Nate," he said. "And this is—" "My wife," Nathaniel said. "Clara. She's been managing our household stores. We thought you might—" "We're a little short," Jim said. He said it the same way Tom Granger had said things, the specific reluctance of a proud man admitting necessity. "Margaret won't say it, but we are." He paused. "The cellar went bad in September. Lost about 1/3 of what we put up." "I know," Clara said gently. "May Watkins mentioned the cellar. I brought what we could carry." Jim looked at the bags on Pete's horse. He looked at Clara. "Come in," he said, and his voice had gone rough in the way voices go rough when relief arrives so suddenly there isn't time to prepare for it. "Margaret will want to meet you." Margaret Henderson was 72 and tiny, and had the eyes of a woman who had seen enough of life to have strong opinions about most of it, and the good manners to keep many of them to herself. She took one look at Clara and said, "You're the one who organized the Callahan kitchen." "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "May Watkins told me about your pantry system," Margaret said. "I've been meaning to come by." Then this, she gestured at the window at the aftermath of 4 days of snow. "Sit down. I'll make tea." "Mrs. Henderson," Clara said, "let me make the tea. You sit down and tell me about your cellar. I'd like to know what happened in September." Margaret looked at her for just a second. Then she sat. It took 20 minutes to understand the Henderson cellar situation, and another 20 to work out a practical solution, using what they had brought and what the Hendersons had remaining. And by the time Clara had it mapped on paper and walked Margaret through it, the older woman was sitting very straight, and her hands were steady, and the particular gray exhaustion that had been around her eyes when they arrived had lifted enough that she looked like herself again. Jim Henderson had been talking to Nathaniel in the other room the whole time. Clara could hear their voices. Not the words, just the cadence. Two men working through something that required honesty on both sides. When she and Margaret came through with tea, the men were quiet in the way men are quiet after they've said something important. Jim looked at Clara. "May Watkins tells me what's happening with Grayson," he said. "The Granger property, the bank." He paused. "The Morrison place 3 years ago, those were friends of ours. We always thought something was wrong with how that happened." "It was," Clara said. "I have documentation." Jim's jaw set. "What can we do?" "Talk to your neighbors," Clara said. "That's what I keep telling everyone, and it keeps being the answer." She looked at him steadily. "Grayson has been operating on the assumption that no one in this valley talks to anyone else about their private financial matters. That assumption is becoming less accurate." Jim looked at Nathaniel. "Your wife," he said. "I know," Nathaniel said. It wasn't a complete sentence, and it didn't need to be. They rode back in the early afternoon, and Pete rode ahead because he had energy to spend, and the horses needed the movement. And Nathaniel and Clara rode side by side at a pace that was slower than necessary, which was a choice, and they both knew it was a choice, and neither of them mentioned it. "You knew about the cellar before we left this morning," Nathaniel said. "I knew Margaret Henderson needed help," Clara said. "I didn't know exactly what kind until we got there. That's why I wanted to come." "You always want to see things yourself," he said. "I trust documentation," she said. "I also know documentation doesn't tell you everything. You have to be in the room." He was quiet for a moment, and the snow was brilliant around them, and the horses moved steadily, and the cold was the clean post-storm cold that has all the bad weather wrung out of it. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "When you arrived," he said. He stopped, tried a different entry point. "I said things to Elias when you got off the coach that you heard. I know you heard them." "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about that for 2 months," he said. "Not because I'm afraid you hold it against me. I don't think you do. But because—" He paused again, and she could hear him working against the difficulty of a man who does not say the important things easily. "Because it was wrong in a way that I should have known better. I look at people, and I calculate their use to me. I have done that my whole life. My father built this ranch that way. I built it further that way. And I looked at you and made a calculation that was—" He stopped. "That was not just wrong. It was the kind of wrong that comes from not actually looking." Clara looked straight ahead between her horse's ears. "I was looking," she said quietly, "at you. When I arrived, before you said what you said to Elias." "What did you see?" he said. "A man who was very good at the world he'd built," she said, "and who had been alone in it for a long time." She paused. "I didn't judge that. I recognized it." He was quiet. "My mother used to say," Clara said, "that the loneliest people are the ones who are most useful to everyone around them, because everyone takes what they need and nobody asks what they need." She glanced at him. When did someone last ask you what you needed, Mr. Callahan? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. They rode in silence for a while, and it was the comfortable kind, now the kind that has room in it, that doesn't press. Then he said, "Nate." She looked at him. "You've been calling me Mr. Callahan for 2.5 months, he said. "My name is Nate." Clara looked at him for a moment. "Nate," she said. He looked back at her. "There it is," he said quietly. They made it back to the ranch by mid-afternoon to find Elias waiting in the yard with an expression that Clara had learned to read as the precursor to information she was not going to enjoy. "Ryder came from town while you were out," Elias said. He was looking at Nathaniel, but Clara could see his eyes flick to her. "From Aldrich." She was off the horse before he finished the sentence. The letter was on the kitchen table where Elias had set it. She opened it, read it. Her face did not change. Nathaniel came in behind her. "What does it say?" She set the letter on the table and turned it so he could read it. He read it. His jaw went tight. Aldrich's colleague had filed the injunction Monday morning as planned. The court had received it, but the bank had moved faster than any of them had anticipated, not through the court, but through a separate mechanism none of them had considered. The bank had transferred the Granger loan to a holding company registered in Denver, a company that Aldrich was in the process of trying to identify, but which had, as of the letter's writing, no recorded connection to Walter Grayson. No recorded connection. "He moved the loan," Nathaniel said. "He moved it before the injunction could attach," Clara said. Her voice was even. She was thinking very fast. "The injunction was filed against the bank. If the loan is no longer held by the bank, the injunction doesn't apply. Not in the same way." She picked up the letter again, read the relevant paragraph a second time. "But Aldrich says the transfer itself may be irregular. If it was done specifically to evade a filed injunction, that's a different legal problem. For the bank. And for whoever directed them to make the transfer." Nathaniel looked at her. "Grayson directed them." "Yes, but proving that is the question." She set the letter down. "Aldrich needs the documentation from the other families. The Morrison situation. The Hendricks. Everything I collected on Saturday." She was already moving toward her notebook. "I need to get him everything we have, all of it, today." "The telegraph office will be open," Nathaniel said. "Roads should be passable by now." He paused. "I'll go myself." She looked at him. "I need to come," she said. "I need to be the one to organize what gets sent. The documentation has a logic to it. Aldrich needs to understand the pattern, not just the individual pieces." "Then we both go," he said. "Both of you can't go," Elias said from the doorway. He had apparently been standing there for the past 2 minutes. "Half the ranch is still dug out. I need Nate on the property." Nathaniel looked at Elias, then at Clara. "Go tight," he said. "Take Pete for the ride. You know the material better than I do." He paused. "And Clara," he stopped. "I'll be careful," she said. "That's not what I was going to say." He looked at her steadily. "I trust your judgment. Whatever you decide Aldrich needs to know, tell him." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook, her document copies, and her coat, and she went. The road into Harlan Creek was rough and slow, and Pete rode without talking, which she appreciated. She organized her thoughts the whole way, arranging the information, the way she arranged everything by logic and pattern, building the clearest possible picture out of the facts available, finding the spine of the argument that would make sense to a lawyer who hadn't been sitting in these kitchens and riding these roads and watching the way Walter Grayson moved through this valley, like something that had learned to be patient because patience worked. When they got to the telegraph office in town, the operator looked up and his expression went through several things quickly. He knew her, or knew of her, which was not the same thing, and he knew Nathaniel Callahan's name, and he was clearly working out what to do with Clara Whitfield, arriving alone with a stack of documents and a focused expression. "I need to send a telegraph to James Aldrich in Cheyenne," she said. "And I need to send it in parts because there's more than will fit in a single message. I'll pay for each one." "That's going to be—" "I know what it's going to cost," she said. "I have the money." He opened his logbook. She sent 7 messages. She was on the fifth one when Walter Grayson walked into the telegraph office. He had not come in because he had known she would be there. She could tell from the way his stride broke just slightly, just one half step of recalibration when he saw her at the window. He had come in for his own reasons and found her instead. The office was small. There was no version of this where they did not have to be in the same room. Grayson recovered quickly. He was good at recovering. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Out alone. Sending correspondence," she said, and turned back to the operator. "Business correspondence," he said. He had come to stand several feet behind her, not close enough to be overtly aggressive, close enough that she was supposed to feel watched. "Yes," she said. "On behalf of your husband." "On behalf of myself," she said. A pause. She could hear him deciding how to play this. She kept her eyes on the operator and her hand steady on the next message. "I heard you had quite a gathering at the ranch on Saturday," Grayson said. Conversational. Easy. Carefully easy. Before the storm, several of the Valley women. "We had visitors, yes," Clara said. "Social call. Of a kind." "Funny timing," he said. "Just before a storm. You'd think people would have been hurrying home instead of sitting around in your kitchen." The operator glanced up at Clara. She met his eyes briefly. He looked back down. "People came together when they understood weather was coming," Clara said. "That seemed natural to me, neighbors looking out for each other." "Is that what you'd call it?" Grayson said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "I would." She handed the operator the next message. She was aware of every movement in the room, Grayson's position, his breathing, the slight shift of his weight. She was also aware that the operator was listening to every word, and that this was a public office, and that Grayson knew it. "I've been hearing things, Mrs. Callahan," Grayson said, "about you asking questions, going through people's private financial documents. People have been sharing information with me voluntarily," she said. "I haven't asked for anything anyone wasn't willing to give." "And what are you doing with it?" She turned and looked at him directly for the first time. "I'm making sure it gets to someone who can read it correctly," she said. His eyes were flat. She had heard him described as charming, and she could see where that reputation came from, the easy confidence, the practiced pleasantness. But charm requires a belief in the performance from the audience, and Clara was not performing belief. "You're making trouble for yourself," he said quietly. "And for your husband." "I'm gathering information," she said. "That's all I'm doing, Mr. Grayson. Information is just information. If there's nothing wrong with what you've been doing in this valley, information can't hurt you." He looked at her. "You should be more careful," he said. "I should send my last 2 messages," she said, and turned back to the window. He stood for another moment. She felt it, the weight of a man deciding whether to escalate. Then she heard his boots on the floor and the office door, and he was gone. The operator let out a slow breath. "I'm going to need to remember every word of that conversation," he said. Clara looked at him. He was young, maybe 25, with ink-stained fingers and honest eyes. "I'd appreciate that," she said. "Would you be willing to write it down?" He pulled out his logbook without being asked and began writing. She sent the last 2 messages. She rode back to the ranch with Pete in the late afternoon, and she rode the whole way, holding something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but sat in the chest like a stone that had been placed there with intent. Grayson had threatened her, not with anything specific, not with anything she could put a legal name to, but he had looked at her and said, "Be more careful," and every word of it had meant the thing it meant. She did not say this to Pete. She said it to Nathaniel when she came in, and he was waiting for her in the kitchen with supper already on, because Elias had apparently decided to cook for once in his life, and the results were edible, if not inspired. She told Nathaniel everything. The conversation word for word, the way she remembered conversations accurately in sequence, with nothing softened or editorialized. When she finished, Nathaniel was very still. "He threatened you," he said. "I was careful not to say anything specific," she said. "He's too smart for that." "Clara." "I'm not frightened," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you because you need to know, not because I need you to fix it." He looked at her. "I know the difference," he said. That stopped her for a moment. She looked at him across the table. "I want to go to the sheriff," he said. "And tell him what?" she said. "That a man told me to be more careful. The sheriff will agree with him." The telegraph operator heard everything. "Yes, and I asked him to write it down." She paused. "But Nate, the sheriff isn't the right move here. The right move is Aldrich. If Aldrich can establish what Grayson has been doing, the pattern, the irregularities, the loan transfers, then what Grayson said to me today becomes part of a larger picture. Without that picture, it's just a conversation in a telegraph office that any lawyer would dismiss in 5 minutes." Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You knew that before you even got back on your horse?" "Yes," she said. "And you still told me." "I tell you the things you need to know," she said. "That's different from asking you to act on them before the time is right." He reached across the table and picked up her notebook, not to read it, just the gesture of picking it up, of handling the thing that was the center of all of this. He set it back down. "I'm going to say something," he said. "And I need you to hear it as something I mean, not as something I think I should say." "All right," she said. "When you walked off that stagecoach," he said, "I looked at you and I thought the agency had made a mistake, that I had made a mistake." He paused. "I was building a list in my head already of reasons to send you back. Your bag, your dress, that wooden box. I'd made up my mind before you opened your mouth." Clara said nothing. She knew he wasn't done. "And now," he said, "I look at you and I think this valley is safer because you're in it. I think this ranch is sounder than it's been in years because you're running half of it without ever asking for credit. I think the Grangers are still on their property and the Hendersons had food through 4 days of storm, and 11 women in this valley know something about Grayson they didn't know before because of you. Because you came here from Missouri with a bag and a wooden box, and you decided to actually look at what was in front of you." He stopped. "I didn't see you," he said. "And I should have." The kitchen was quiet around them. The fire in the stove. The sound of the wind that had gone gentle, now spent from 4 days of fury. Clara looked at this man, this closed, difficult, proud, unexpectedly decent man, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't quite known was tight. "You see me now," she said. "Yes," he said. "I do." She looked down at her notebook. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's something I haven't told you." He waited. She reached into her coat pocket. She had carried the folded oilcloth packet with her since she left Missouri, because some things you didn't leave behind even when you should. She set it on the table between them. "The letters from my father," she said. "The legal matter I mentioned once and didn't explain." He looked at the packet. "It's a banker in St. Louis," she said. "He seized my family's property through an improper loan process. Not identical to what Grayson's been doing here, but close enough that when I started seeing what Grayson was doing, I recognized it." She paused. "I came to Wyoming partly because I needed a start over, but partly because I needed to be somewhere I could figure out how to finish what happened to my family. I needed resources, knowledge, time." She stopped. "I should have told you before now." Nathaniel looked at the packet, then at her. "Why didn't you?" he said. "Because it was mine," she said. "And I had learned not to trust people with things that were mine." He was quiet for a long moment. "And now?" She met his eyes. "Now I'm trusting you," she said. "With this. Because I think you should know the whole of who I am, not just the part that's useful to you." He picked up the packet. He did not open it. He looked at her first, asking silently. She nodded. He opened it and began to read. She watched his face as he read, and his face did not stay still. She saw him understand what he was looking at. She saw him recognize the pattern. She saw him reach the final letter, the one from the third lawyer, the one who had pulled out because the judge was the banker's cousin, and his jaw set in a way she recognized now as something other than simple anger. It was the particular anger of a man who has just discovered that something wrong was done to someone who did not deserve it. He set the letters down. He looked at her. "Aldrich," he said. "When we're done with Grayson, when this is settled, I want to send these to Aldrich." Clara stared at him. He has colleagues in St. Louis, Nathaniel said. He told me once he came up from there. He'd know who to approach. He paused. I'll cover whatever it costs. Nate, you have spent 2.5 months protecting this ranch, he said. And these people, and everyone in this valley who didn't know they needed protecting. His voice was steady, but not easy. Let me do this one thing. She looked at him for a long time. She had come to Wyoming needing a start. She had not allowed herself to expect that the start would include someone looking at the whole of her history and deciding it mattered. Deciding she mattered. Not as a housekeeper, not as a manager, not even as a wife. As a person. With a past that deserved justice and a future that deserved to be built on something real. Her hands were very still on the table. All right, she said. He nodded once. Outside, the last light was going from the sky, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, a fiddle had started up again the same wandering tune, but fuller somehow, a second instrument joining it, that Clara hadn't heard before, someone who had been listening for long enough to have learned the melody. She reached across the table and picked up her notebook. Opened it to a clean page. December 3rd, she wrote. Aldrich to receive full documentation. Western case and St. Louis case. Nate knows everything. She paused. Then she wrote, It is possible I am no longer alone in this. She looked at what she'd written. She did not underline it. Some things she was learning did not need to be underlined to be permanent. Aldrich's full response arrived on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, and it came not by telegraph, but by courier, a young man on a fast horse who had ridden through the night from Cheyenne with a leather satchel that he handed to Nathaniel with both hands, which was itself a signal that what was inside mattered. Nathaniel brought it to the kitchen without opening it. He set it on the table in front of Clara. She looked at it, then at him. You open it, she said. It's your work, he said. You open it. She did. Aldrich had written 14 pages. Clara read them straight through without speaking, without pausing, without any expression that Nathaniel could clearly read, and he sat across from her and waited, because he had learned that this was what she needed room to think, without someone trying to read her while she did it. When she finished, she set the pages down flat on the table. She put both palms on top of them. She looked up. He has enough, she said. Nathaniel leaned forward. Enough to file a formal complaint with the Territorial Banking Authority against the Harlan Creek Savings Bank for improper loan modification on at minimum 3 documented accounts. She paused. Enough to pursue a separate civil action against Walter Grayson for coordination of fraudulent foreclosure proceedings based on the pattern of transactions and the testimony of the telegraph operator. Another pause. And enough Aldrich believes to have the loan transfer to the Denver Holding Company reviewed as a deliberate attempt to obstruct a filed court injunction, which is not a civil matter, that's criminal. The word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. Nathaniel was very quiet. Criminal, he said. Aldrich used the word deliberately, Clara said. He doesn't use words he doesn't mean. Nathaniel sat back. She watched him process it, the full weight of it, what it meant for Grayson, what it meant for the valley, what it meant for the 2 years Grayson had spent building something he had believed was unassailable, because he had built it carefully and quietly, and counted on no one being both willing and able to look at the whole picture at once. He miscalculated, Nathaniel said. He miscalculated what a woman with a wooden box of recipe cards would do when she had time and access and a reason, Clara said. Nathaniel looked at her. Something in his face moved that warmth she had been watching grow in him for weeks, no longer brief or quickly controlled. It simply lived there now, settled and undisguised. What happens next, he said. Aldrich files Monday, she said. He wants us in Cheyenne by Wednesday for a meeting with the banking authority's representative. He says we should bring everything. All the original documents. We, Nathaniel said. He specifically said both of us, Clara said. He wants your testimony about the water rights conversation and the property offers. And he wants mine about the documentation process and the community accounts. She paused. I told him in my last telegraph that the information came from multiple families. He says that's the strongest part of the case. It's not one person's word against Grayson's, It's a pattern that 7 families can corroborate. Nathaniel stood up. He was already thinking in logistics. She could see it the way his mind shifted from the weight of information to the machinery of action. It was something she had come to find quietly and without announcement, deeply reassuring about him. He did not get paralyzed by what was large. He got organized. "I'll tell Elias we're riding to Cheyenne," he said. "Pete can run the morning operations. May Watkins will keep an eye on things she'll want to anyway." "She'll be here before you finish saddling the horses," Clara said. He almost smiled. "You've already told her." "I told her last night," Clara said. "I thought the letter might say what it says." He stopped and looked at her. "You thought it might say this, and you still let me open it with you this morning, as if you didn't know." "I didn't know," she said. "I hoped. There's a difference." She looked down at the pages at Aldrich's careful legal prose, covering 14 sheets of paper, the architecture of accountability, built from 2 months of kitchen table conversations and borrowed documents and a notebook filled with small, even handwriting. "I've hoped for a lot of things in my life that didn't work out," she said. "I've learned not to call it knowing until it's real." He crossed to her side of the table. She looked up at him. He was very close, and she did not move back, and for a moment they were simply standing in a kitchen in Wyoming. In December, 2 people who had come to this from opposite directions and arrived somehow at the same place. "It's real," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He reached out and covered her hands. Both of them still pressed flat on Aldrich's 14 pages with one of his. Just for a moment. Just long enough to mean what it meant. Then he went to find Elias, and Clara went to pack the documents. They rode to Cheyenne on Tuesday and arrived Wednesday morning, and the meeting with the banking authority's representative lasted 3 hours and was conducted in a wood-paneled office that smelled like old paper and coal smoke and the particular serious atmosphere of official proceedings. Clara sat beside Nathaniel and across from Aldrich, who was precisely as unpleasant and precise and thorough, as advertised, and answered every question she was asked in full with documentation to support each answer in an order she had prepared the night before, so that the logic of it was unmissable. The banking authority's representative, a man named Collier, who had the tired, careful eyes of someone who has seen a great deal of creative dishonesty in his professional life, asked her at one point, "Mrs. Callahan, how did you come to examine the Granger loan documents?" "Ruth Granger showed them to me," Clara said. "She was frightened, and she didn't know what she was looking at. I did." "How did you know what you were looking at?" Clara paused for exactly 1 beat. "Because something similar was done to my family," she said. "In Missouri, by a different banker. I learned what proper loan documentation looks like by spending 2 years trying to prove that ours wasn't." Collier looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook. "And the other families," he said. "How did you gather their documentation?" "I cooked for them," Clara said. Collier stopped writing. "I beg your pardon. I invited the women of the valley to my kitchen," she said. "We talked about food preservation and supply management. And then we talked about what was happening in the valley, and they brought me what they had." She paused. "People talk in kitchens, Mr. Collier. They always have." Nobody thought to listen. Aldrich, to his credit, did not smile. But something shifted in his expression that suggested he might under different circumstances. Collier looked at Nathaniel. "You were aware of your wife's activities throughout this process." "Fully aware," Nathaniel said, "and fully supportive." "She acted on your behalf." "She acted on behalf of this valley," Nathaniel said. "I supported that. There's a difference." Collier looked at them both. Then he looked at the stack of documents Clara had laid out on his desk, organized by family, by date, by type, with a summary page on top that Aldrich had helped her draft, but which she had substantially written herself. 14 families. 3 years of documented irregularities. 7 first-person accounts. 1 telegraph operator's written record of a conversation that had been meant to be a private threat and had instead become evidence. "Mrs. Callahan," Collier said, "this is the most thorough documentation I have received in 11 years in this position." Clara held his gaze. "I had good reason to be thorough," she said. The formal complaint against the Harlan Creek Savings Bank was filed that afternoon. The civil action against Walter Grayson was filed the following morning. The criminal referral for obstruction of judicial process related to the loan transfer was filed simultaneously, and that was the one Aldrich told them quietly over a late dinner in Cheyenne before they rode back that Grayson had not anticipated. The civil action he could fight. The banking complaint he could manage. The criminal referral put him in a position no amount of money or patience had prepared him for, because criminal proceedings required a different kind of defense and moved on a different kind of timeline. "He'll settle," Aldrich said. "Men like Grayson always settle when the criminal exposure is real. He'll try to make it go away quietly." "Can he?" Nathaniel asked. "Not entirely," Aldrich said. "Not given the documentation. The banking authority is already reviewing the other two accounts, Morrison and Hendricks. If those families are compensated—" "They should be compensated," Clara said. Aldrich looked at her. "That may require a longer process," he said carefully. "Then the process should be longer," she said. "I didn't do this for the Callahans alone." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked back at him with an expression that said clearly and without apology, "This is my wife, and this is how it is." "No," Aldrich said finally. "I didn't imagine you did." They rode home on Thursday and arrived late, and the ranch was quiet, and the kitchen was cold, and Clara built the fire herself while Nathaniel saw to the horses. When he came in, she had coffee ready, and they sat at the kitchen table for the first time since leaving, and just existed in the quiet of being home. She had not thought of it as home until she thought the word just then and found it was already true. "The St. Louis matter," she said. "Aldrich's colleague is reviewing the documents," Nathaniel said. "He thinks it's worth pursuing. He's writing to me next week." She had not asked for an update. He had gotten one anyway, and he was giving it to her across the kitchen table at 11 at night, because he had understood without being told that it would matter to her before she could sleep. She looked at her coffee. "My mother worked herself to exhaustion," she said. "For 30 years. She ran a household and raised children and managed everything that needed managing, and when that banker took the property, she had been feeding and clothing and keeping warm for 3 decades. She had nothing in her name. Nothing to show for it." She paused. Not because she hadn't worked, because nobody had ever thought to put her name on anything. Nathaniel was very still. "I want her name on the restitution claim," Clara said. "If Aldrich's colleague can get the case reopened. Whatever comes back, I want it recorded under her name. Margaret Whitfield." She looked up. "She's gone, so it doesn't matter practically, but it matters." "It matters," Nathaniel said quietly. "I'll tell Aldrich." She nodded. They sat in silence for a while, and it was the deepest kind of comfortable silence, the kind that has been earned. Then Nathaniel said, "I want to show you something." She looked at him. He stood up and went to the front room, and she followed, and he went to the roll-top desk in the corner, the one she had never been invited to approach, and he unlocked the lower drawer and pulled out a folded document. He spread it on the desk surface. It was the ranch property record. The official filing with the Territorial Land Office listing the Callahan Ranch, its acreage, its water rights, its recorded improvements. She had never seen it before. He had added something. At the bottom of the record, in a line that had not been there before in ink that was still relatively new, was a notation she had to lean close to read. Co-proprietor, Clara Margaret Callahan, née Whitfield. She straightened up. She did not say anything for a moment. Her mother's middle name had been Margaret. "When did you do this?" she said, and her voice was very even because she was working to keep it that way. 3 weeks ago," he said. "When I sent the first set of documents to Aldrich, I went to the land office the same day." He paused. "I should have done it sooner, but I wanted to do it for the right reason. Not because it was practical, not because it protected the ranch legally, because it was true." He looked at her. "This is your ranch too. You've been building it as much as I have, more in some ways, and I wanted the record to say what's real." Clara looked at her name on the document. Her mother's name in the middle of hers on a piece of paper that would be held in the Territorial Land Office for as long as the Callahan Ranch existed. She had come to Wyoming with one bag and a wooden box, because she had nothing left in Missouri and needed a place to begin. She had not come expecting justice. She had not come expecting partnership. She had certainly not come expecting to find herself standing in a ranch house in December, looking at her own name on a property record that represented 12 years of someone else's work, and 2 months of her own, combined and recorded as something that belonged to both of them. She had come expecting to survive. She had built something instead. "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was true, and because she had learned was still learning to say the true things instead of keeping them in her notebook. "This is the first piece of paper with my name on it that I haven't had to fight to get." He looked at her. "That changes today," he said. She believed him. News moves through a valley the way weather does, without asking permission, following the low places. By the time January arrived, Harlan Creek knew the broad shape of what had happened. Not the legal details, those were in Cheyenne, moving through processes that would take months, but the human shape. That Walter Grayson had been filing and scheming, and that the Callahan ranch owner's wife had been quietly, systematically taking it apart. That the banking authority was involved. That the Granger property was safe. That the Morrison and Hendricks families were going to receive a formal review of their foreclosures. People talked about it the way people talk about things that rearrange something in their understanding. In the first week of January, a woman Clara had never met rode 6 miles to the ranch and knocked on the kitchen door. Her name was Dora Sampson. She had a property 20 miles north that Clara hadn't known about, and a loan document she had been keeping in a box under her bed for 2 years because something about it had never felt right. But she hadn't known what to do with that feeling. Clara sat her down, made coffee, and looked at the document. It took her 11 minutes to find the irregularity. Dora Sampson watched Clara write in her notebook, watched her hands move with the particular calm speed of someone who knows exactly what they're doing, and said, "How do you know all this?" "Practice," Clara said. "And you'll help me?" "Yes," Clara said. "I'll help you." Dora left with Aldrich's address and a list of exactly what to send him and what to say. She was not the last. In January alone, 4 women came to the kitchen door with papers and questions, and the particular cautious hope of people who have been waiting for a long time for someone to tell them their instincts were right. Clara helped all of them. She organized what they had and sent it to Aldrich with notes explaining the context. She built a filing system in the spare bedroom that was no longer spare, a system of folders and dates and names that tracked with the same precision as her pantry inventory. Everything that had been done wrong in this valley, and what was being done to correct it. Nathaniel watched it happen and did not try to manage it. He built a second shelf in the spare bedroom without being asked. He told Elias to answer the door if Clara was occupied. He told Pete that whoever came to the kitchen on business was to be treated as a visitor of the ranch and offered hospitality accordingly. He told Clara one evening, "You're running something bigger than a kitchen now." "I've always been running something bigger than a kitchen," she said. "People just didn't see it." "I see it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it works." The Grayson case settled in February. Not publicly, Grayson's lawyers made sure it was as quiet as they could manage, which was considerably less quiet than they had hoped, because Aldrich was not interested in quiet, and the banking authority had its own reasons for wanting the record clear. The bank manager resigned. The bank itself was placed under a 6-month review. Grayson did not go to prison. The criminal referral produced a fine and a formal censure, and a supervised period that effectively ended his ability to use the bank as a tool, but he lost the 2 properties he had taken improperly, and those properties were returned. When the Hendricks family received their restitution letter, the old man rode directly to the Callahan ranch and sat in Clara's kitchen for an hour. He was 74 years old, and he had not cried when they took his land, and he cried now. Clara sat with him and did not say anything that wasn't useful. She made coffee. She listened. She let him feel what he needed to feel without trying to move him through it faster than he was moving. When he left, he shook her hand and held it for a moment with both of his and said, "You're the best thing that ever came to this valley, Mrs. Callahan." Clara looked at him. "Tell the next person who needs help to come find me," she said. He did. They always did. In March, a letter arrived from Aldrich's colleague in St. Louis. Clara read it at the kitchen table with Nathaniel across from her, and when she finished, she set it down and was quiet for a long moment. The case was reopened. The banker who had taken her family's property had in the years since done similar things to 3 other families. The evidence base was now substantial. It would take time, these things always took time, but the colleague believed there was a genuine path to restitution. Her mother's name would be on the claim. Nathaniel watched her read it, and watched her set it down, and watched the quality of her stillness, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of something settling into place after a very long journey. "Clara," he said. "I'm all right," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I just wanted to say your name." She looked at him across the table. This man who had looked at her on a street in October and seen a mistake, and had spent 4 months discovering piece by piece, and entirely on his own terms, that he had been wrong in the most complete possible way. "Nate," she said. "There it is," he said. Same words as before. Different weight behind them. The weight of everything that had happened between October and March. The storm, the documents, Cheyenne. The spare bedroom full of folders. The women who came to the kitchen door. The name on the property record. The letter from St. Louis. She reached across the table. He met her halfway. They sat like that for a while. Hands joined across a kitchen table in Wyoming in March. 2 people who had built something real out of materials neither of them had intended to use in a place neither of them had imagined would become the place they meant. Outside, the snow was finally releasing. The valley was beginning to show through beneath it, the green underneath patient waiting for its moment. The kitchen was warm. The stove was burning. The notebook was on the table open to a page dated that morning, and in Clara's small even handwriting it said simply, "March 14th, letter from St. Louis. The case is reopened." And below that underlined twice because some things needed it. "We are not finished. We are only beginning." Elias Boone appeared in the kitchen doorway at noon, the way he always appeared without announcement, as if the land itself had grown him there. He looked at the 2 of them at the table, at their joined hands, at the letter and the notebook and the coffee and the general unmistakable atmosphere of a room in which something permanent had been decided. He nodded once. "Lunch," he said, "is going to need someone to actually make it." Clara laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she hadn't known she'd stopped making until she heard herself make it again. "Sit down, Elias," she said. She stood up and went to the stove. He sat. Nathaniel sat. And in the kitchen of the Callahan Ranch on a March afternoon, when the valley was waking up, and the cases were filed, and the names were on the records, and the bread was going in the oven, and the people who mattered were at the table. Clara Whitfield Callahan, who had stepped off a stagecoach in October with 1 bag and a wooden box, and nothing else except what she knew and what she was made lunch. She made it well. She made it for the right people. And the woman nobody believed in became the reason an entire valley learned to believe in itself, because she never stopped believing in what she could build, even when she was the only one who could see it. That is the truest thing that can be said about her.